Assalamu alaikum and welcome to FOA webinar. We are living through a COVID pandemic that has cost over 125,000 lives in the UK, a nation that is emotionally wounded. This is a time of crisis where people are looking to the government for honest information and guidance. However, we are being led by a government of Boris Johnson that has used the tragedy of COVID to award nearly £1 billion in COVID-19 contracts to 15 companies, all of which are linked to the Conservative Party donors. There are also rumors that journalists who criticize the government are more likely to be shunned or even boycotted. The government is passing an anti-protest bill that many say will undermine civil liberties. Above this, the government is consulting on how to limit public rights to challenge it. This is all happening while not only the government but the Prime Minister himself is accused of misleading the Parliament and the mainstream media failing to hold politicians to account. To discuss the integrity of our politicians, in particularly Boris Johnson, and the failure of the media to hold politicians to account, I have with me an individual who has spent nearly 30 years observing, recording, and reporting on the British political scene. He has written for The Spectator, The Daily Mail, and The Telegraph. He is regular on the BBC programmes Any Questions, Question Time, and often presents The Week in Westminster. Over the years, he has won many awards for his analysis and groundbreaking reporting. He was also voted as Columnist of the Year at the Press Awards in 2013. He is the author of numerous books, including the one we want to focus on today, The Assault on Truth, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and the Emergence of New Moral Barbarism. He is, of course, Peter Oborne. Welcome and thank you, Peter, for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Ismail. I'm really grateful. And I apologize for my lockdown hair. It's very disrespectful, but I don't know what to do about it.
I think we're all in the same boat. But Peter, before we start, I think the main sort of discussion of your book and the contents, I think it'd be nice to just chart your career and briefly tell us how you, from being the chief political correspondent of The Telegraph, you ended up writing for what many would consider fringe papers like the Middle East Eye and now the Byline.
Yeah, well, the Middle East Eye isn't fringe. By the way, I'm very honored to write for Middle East Eye, which I think does an incredible job telling the truth about what's happening in the Middle East. And Byline Times, which tells an enormous amount about what is happening in British politics and in British media at the moment. They've got very important voices. Well, I tell you something. I mean, I was a very conventional conservative journalist, and my path to perdition, Ismail, begins really with the Iraq War, where it made me realize that there was something wrong about the way in which global events and British foreign policy was presented. And also I realized after the Iraq War, and I then I started to set my mind to work. The way Islam and Muslims are written about in British newspapers and presented in the British media, there was something absolutely wrong and abominable about it, actually. And so I started to write about that a lot. And that, in fact, led me to leave the Telegraph eventually, because many people watching, listening might know that I discovered that quite a number of prominent Muslims have been stripped of their bank accounts, no reason given, mainly by the ones I discovered were by HSBC, although it's much more widespread than that. HSBC, and I just couldn't get the story into the Telegraph, and discovered not that the Telegraph was doing it because it was against Muslims, but it was too fond of HSBC's advertising revenue, and that was troubling because of the the journalist should tell the truth, and so I left, and then I had another problem during the run-up to the 2019 general election, when it was so obvious that Boris Johnson was telling lies, and the media was collaborating in those lies, that I needed to write about that, and I needed to describe how the sort of press machine he brought into Downing Street was working with senior British journalists, political editors, to produce rubbish, produce falsehoods, and that led me in the end to write an article which has basically meant I'm not used by the mainstream media anymore.
Is this the article you're referring to in the Open Democracy? British journalists have become part of Johnson's fake news.
Yes, and having written that article, I thought that was that, but when the coronavirus situation turned up, and a very grave situation, terrible tragedy, and I saw the way in which the Johnson government was misleading the British public about that I then thought, I didn't really want to do it, but I wrote the book about called The Assault on Truth, which you very kindly showed people.
Fine. So that brings us, at least you've sort of outlined two factors here that how society operates. One is money and influence, indirect or direct, as my case you learn from Telegraph advertising for SHBC, excuse me. And second is power, political power itself, how it can be influencing in ideas and what is put out there, how the mainstream media is silenced, if you like. But there's a third aspect of your book, which is, I think, the central theme that carries through. And you say something that is very important in your book, that lying is a form of theft. Now, I mean, they are very strong words. Can you expand on that?
Well, if we live in what purports or claims to be a democracy, this is a central claim made by all our leading politicians. And if the voter should be treated with respect, if he's going to he or she is going to make judgments about who to vote for, they should be judgments based on facts which can be verified. And if the wholesale lying made by the political parties over the years, but actually in the last election by the Johnson Conservative Party, means that voters are not making decisions which are made on truth or verified. They are they're being lied to, and they're having that. And that means actually that their democratic rights are being stripped away from them because they're making their judgments on the basis of falsehood. And the analogy there, I first worked all of this out when I wrote a book in 2005, The Rise of Political Lying, which was, a lot of it was based on the experience of the Iraq War and the justifications given for that, which were false weapons of mass destruction, which didn't exist. So British voters were urged to support the Iraq War, but also it was part of the legal basis for the war, was a complete falsehood.
Let me come back to that lying aspect of politicians in a minute, but what I want to ask you is, obviously you've made some major claims in this book, which we'll go through. And for me, what I found really interesting and reassuring is most of your claims are backed up by footnotes, which shows that you've done your homework and you're not polemic, and that comes across very strong. So if you would say something like that, even about me, I would want to sue you. So just a question, have you received a sort of litigation from Boris Johnson or anybody before we enter into these aspects?
No, I haven't received any charge. You're quite right. It is libelous to say that somebody lies. Particularly, anybody, if you say they are a liar, that is a libel because it affects their reputation. It means they're they are not trustworthy. And I have had no comeback at all in that respect.
Okay, that's quite reassuring. Now, before we go into your book and look at the assessments of how you assess Boris Johnson, the aspect of politicians lying is nothing new. I mean, we are very much in the world, especially me and you, we know about Profumo, particularly most of our listeners today and viewers will resonate with Blair's lies, especially, the 60 seconds weapons of mass destruction. So what's different with Boris Johnson?
I think that it's a very dangerous thing that all politicians lie. That cynical approach means that it gives a free pass to politicians who really do lie, or very bad liars. So most politicians, of course, they find themselves in circumstances where from time to time they slide over the truth, or they say something which is dishonest. But most politicians do their best. Most British prime ministers over time have, I think, done their best to tell the truth. Sometimes it's very hard to do it, and sometimes it's difficult not to tell the truth for honourable reasons. You know, if you think about the D-Day landings, the great deception about the D-Day landings, you'd have to be a really scrupulous person to say that wasn't correct, that it wasn't reasonable to deceive the Germans about where the British landing people were right. And so there are justifications for political lying. However, what is really quite astonishing about the Johnson lying is that it's so profligate, and it comes from the conservative tradition. There's always been a progressive tradition that, because of the overwhelming virtue of the progressive movements, left-wing ideas, because they are left-wing politicians often very genuinely and sometimes correctly see themselves as working to make the society much better, that they are in a way justified in their lying in order to fight dark conservative forces which are aligned against them, the venal press and so on, the dark forces which left-wing movements have often had to fight against. Johnson comes from a conservative tradition, which has always been about observing due process. Like Trump, they come from a conservative tradition, and once they are taken away from the conservative respect for truth-telling, due process, respect for institutions, it takes you into a nightmare world where lying is about power, only power.
But how is, I mean, let me go back to Boris Johnson. In one passage, I think, if I recall it right, is you praise Boris Johnson's abilities as a journalist and his efficiency while he was an editor, I think, at The Spectator. Yet the same individual, then I quote you, "I have never encountered a senior British politician who lies and fabricates so regularly, so shamelessly and so systematically as Boris Johnson." How is this transformation, do you think, took place, apart from the fact that you talk about the power hungry or the need to gain power?
It's very, I try to explain this. I worked for Mr. Johnson at The Spectator as political correspondent for 4 years. I was a very important part of his team. We spoke every week, several times a week often. And he had a brilliant brain. And actually, I thought that he was and the way my interface with him was fantastic. A very warm relationship. I never caught him. He never lied, as far as I was concerned, and he didn't. And I thought he ran a very good newspaper, which had represented all sides of view. So what happened? I think it was when he made a deal with the Leave campaign, who were utterly in a way I failed to understand for a long time, were totally unscrupulous because they had that almost Leninist Marxist view, even though they came mainly from the right, that the ends justified the means. They were they could say anything they liked so long as it justified the objective they were seeking, which was Britain's exit from the European Union. And I think that did take Boris Johnson into Downing Street. There's no question. He then brought them back when he became Prime Minister. Dominic Cummings and various others were brought into Downing Street, and they were totally cynical about the facts. They just fought. They were quite shockingly dishonest, actually.
The Brexit alliance was, of course, with the Leave campaign, who are a non-governmental body, or non-public body, rather, excuse me. And there's quite a lot of, you cover that quite well in your book. You want to expand on that for us? What happens there when a non-public body tries to bring about a political, I suppose it's almost political campaigning, almost in the face?
Again, I think I rebuke myself for not understanding exactly the sophistication or the nature of this campaigning. When I saw Mr. Johnson campaign for Brexit, I thought that was democratic. I thought that there are very, very strong democratic arguments for Brexit. But what we know now about, it was a lot of money, a lot of donors, a lot of abuse of money. And also, this is the thing I rebuke, the use of sort of dark emotions, particularly on immigration, I think, to capture people, voters for their cause. It was very sophisticated, and it completely outmaneuvered the pro-Remain machine.
The second aspect you cover in your book very well is, of course, from Brexit. We talk about the general election in 2019, where the Conservative, I think, party went as far as changing its Twitter account to a Fact Check UK and giving out falsehood about Jeremy Corbyn. There's two aspects here. Of course, the act itself by the Conservatives. Here we are talking about the wider Conservative Party more than Joe Sponson, who allowed it to happen. But the fact that there wasn't a cry from the media in particular.
Being part of that campaign. That is to say, when Mr. Johnson made false claims day by day about Jeremy Corbyn's kind of dismantling, apparently he was going to dismantle the armed forces, he was going to get rid of, I think I'm right in saying, the intelligence services, he was going to sort of spend astronomical sums, he was going to make everybody very poor. That was, I list these lies, campaigning lies, and they were not exposed. They were not subject to the scrutiny which should properly have been done. And I'm afraid that it was not just the newspapers, the BBC and some of the other broadcasters just had no appetite to expose the lies being told by Johnson. Another one involved, building 40 new hospitals, or lots of them. And I think that was dereliction of duty. The job of the media is to hold power, political parties, political leaders, governments to account. And actually they became part of the Conservative party machine, which was a gross dereliction of what it should mean to be a journalist. I will say here that because I'm talking to you, Ismail, Muslims know what this is like. You've the Trojan horse affair, grooming gangs. You know what it is to be subject to systematic falsehoods told about you and in the media, but that is what happened more generally in the 2019 campaign.
I mean, when you draw that comparison, it's quite frightening, not because for any minority group, but for overall democracy and politics in the country. Because what you sort of almost directing towards is there's a hegemonic culture which is pervaded with almost duplicity and falsehood, and that is surely not good for our country and where we're heading to, particularly now that we've left Brexit and we have to now build relationship and trust with other nations and country and new people.
Yeah, I think it is. Whether it is an interest, I do brood about this. Is it duplicitous? I think that most of the people who are part of this, what you call hegemonic culture, actually genuinely believe what they write. It is simply that they have become very tribal in their affiliations and in their analysis. They instead of trying to look behind the facts or look behind the headlines and to get to the truth, they think they know the truth and they just live with that. And I think one of the great things we have to do is to re-examine the way in which we understand the world, the more you understand something, work at understanding something, the more research you do, the more people you talk to, the more you engage with the other side and understand their point of view, the more complicated and difficult the world gets, but also you start to understand the truth. And what we have seen over the last, 20 years, you get one sort of great wave of falsehood after another, which is very hard to challenge. I think we have to. It's very dangerous, and the right has been particularly successful at spreading these myths.
Do you think? Let's come back to that again. I think that's very important. But I want to come to your third aspect, if your categories of lies from Boris Johnson and his government. We talked about Brexit, we talked about the election, and the third one is, of course, you talk about the coronavirus pandemic, where we mentioned wave of false misrepresentations and fabrications have taken place. That's something I think that needs expanding upon, Peter, for our audience, so they understand that, relatively what is happening in Britain to the rest of the world and how this issue has been presented to the public. Because on the one side, we have the great success story that is carpeted out, if you like, in particularly with the success of the injections. But on the other side, we've had the high death toll of nearly 125,000 people, if not more. And of course, that is now all forgotten and buried.
Yeah, well, let's starting with the injections, the vaccines. I think it's a huge credit to Mr. Johnson's government. They made a really difficult decision, which I thought at the time I was surprised by, which was to break away from the combined European approach and have a British-only vaccine. And then and the political costs of getting that wrong would have been enormous. And actually, they executed this brilliantly. The woman, Kate Bingham, daughter of Lord Chief Justice Bingham, by the way, a great figure in the great law lord. I can't praise her too highly, but equally there were political decisions made which enabled her, but then to do her great job, which was to identify the most promising vaccines and buy them. And it succeeded brilliantly, and they deserve a huge amount of credit. Before then, there were a series of really terrible errors, and they were far too slow to lock down, not just once, but twice. They pursued, they were very, very negligent when it came to care homes and then lied about it. You can go on and list these things, and they were very kind of casual about it. I make a comparison with Angela Merkel in Germany, who much more sensible, much more low key, much more about me. There's a lovely idea of public duty in politics. You don't go into it to promote your own vanity or your own you go into it to serve the nation. And one of the besetting sins of the current generation of politics is it's all about showing off. And I think Angela Merkel had a lovely kind of restrained sense. She'd come from a much more difficult, she was brought up under Soviet communism in East Germany. She knew about barbarism. And I think she was much more respectful of, and much more grateful to live in a stable social democratic system which was being played with, I think, by Johnson and his fellow ministers.
I suppose one way to stop the barbarism, political barbarism, shall we say, to surface itself in Britain or British political structure is our civil servants. And of course, there's a big section that Johnson was pivotal in undermining them. And you mentioned Mark Sidwell, Philip Rothman, and Simon MacDonald, and the undermining of the permanent secretary. I think that's very important. And I was really surprised when I read your book that it was not covered as extensively in the media as it becomes apparent when we read your book. Again, I mean, what has happened to the structure or the people around who notice this, the politicians and the other people who admire the whole political structure, the stability of the political structure of Britain, and that is being corroded away now?
Yeah, well, it's not just that it wasn't written about. A lot of the papers, as I show, were part of the used to attack and undermine the senior civil servants, Sedwell, MacDonald, and others. And that's what I mean by them becoming part of the machine. And there's this, what they're doing is affecting a revolution. What Johnson and his cronies have done is to make a revolution in Britain, because historically, going back 200 years, we've had a distinction between the politicians who get elected and civil servants who are there permanently. And unlike in America, where when you get a new Democratic or a Republican administration, a whole load of the senior civil servants go. Here they stay, and they then carry out the commands of the elected politicians, but they have the independence, the impartiality, the understanding of how things work. And what Johnson has done quite deliberately is to essentially turn the civil servants into Tory party apparatchiks or loyalists, and this has caused enormous tension and upset. And it's produced figures like Lord Frost, the EU negotiator. He seems to me quite incompetent, but does have the great merit of being loyal to the Prime Minister.
You mentioned, of course, public life in Britain is sort of geared or directed by something called the Nolan Principles, which you cover very well in your book. And I'll just read you that these principles, the Nolan's principles, have been undermined. Now the government, or in particular you indicate towards Boris Johnson, they can bully staff and get away with it. They can undermine civil servants and not pay the price. They can award contracts to cronies and nobody minds. In effect, the Nolan Principles have become irrelevant today. Now, this, of course, to those who are around him, either in the media, but more importantly than that, within the Parliament and the wider political circle, are aware of Boris Johnson and what he's doing and his close allies. So why have they been allowed, why he himself has become allowed to become a leader? And how was it that the British public was duped into voting for him? And I mean, I can understand by saying that by media remaining silent, but I think we need to go a bit deeper and try and understand what the political milieu of mindset of the British society is overall.
It's such a sharp change that it's difficult, difficult to understand entirely. It's a sort of, it's only speculation what I'm now going to say to you. If you go back to World War II, there had been a great communal effort, a huge national sacrifice to defeat fascism. In my view, it was the finest hour, as Churchill said, it was our finest hour. The British Empire committed many crimes, but heading off Nazism was a glorious achievement. And all classes have come together. By the way, so many people from what were then called the colonies have kind of helped. So how many 100,000 Muslims there were fought very bravely, incredibly bravely, and lost their lives. And there was a sort of sense of national unity and a sense of national self-sacrifice. And life was then not about me, it was about the community. And I think we we've thrown that away. We put money before honor. We put our own self-projection ahead of the nation and ahead of a sense of duty. And I think we became very frivolous as a nation. And we didn't understand, or we chose to forget the importance of institutions and of self-sacrifice and duty. And we put ourselves first. I'm talking not about everybody, but the people who were governing the country. And one thing which really happened, and the collapse of civil society was important, the area of public space, which is not part of the market, not part of the state, but schools, the area which we all have in common, became narrowed and contracted, partly attacked from the right, which wanted to marketize it, partly attacked from the left, which wanted to expand the state. And in the last 10, 20 years, and I was slow to understand this, but not as slow as some, we've seen the way the Conservative Party was captured by large corporate donors, actually, no, should I say corporate donors, private donors normally, very rich men started to realize that they could buy the great institutions of this country. We're seeing the rather squalid scandal involving David Cameron is just one tiny episode of that, example of that. And I think that is what has happened. We've got a long journey back to reclaim what we stand for.
So, I mean, this is where we almost started from, Peter, that one, there is an element of money that is corrosive or trying to obey it in the sense of not make sure that we have as much as possible and try and bring in money without any moral or ethics. On the second aspect, we discussed as well the aspect of power, that people who normally hold power to question are no longer doing that for two reasons. One, money, on the other side itself, to make sure that they don't get disenfranchised by those who are powerful. But then that brings us to a third aspect, that what is the ideological mindset of these people and which direction is the country heading? Because that's, for me, is much more worrying, because all these two are obviously being dictated by either the very powerful and the rich, but they have also an agenda, which means, we have a much wider social divide, whether it be economical divide, cultural divide, and then we have the increase of nationalism and xenophobia. So this direction that it's moving in, for me, it looks quite dangerous. How do you read it?
I completely agree. One of the terrifying things, actually, of the Johnson administration, and this is another thing which really surprised me about Boris Johnson, who was a very liberal, generous-minded person when that's the way he came across, and I think it was quite authentic, actually, has allowed himself to be, that's when he was at The Spectator when I worked with him, has allowed himself to ally himself with quite dark, far-right movements, which target minorities. They seem to, and have made a fetish of Britain's imperial past, which we used to have as Britain we had enough self-confidence to be challenged, to have our, to have our record properly and examined in a scholarly way, and to deal with all of that. Now we have a sort of view that you can't criticize. Winston Churchill was a very great man. I mean, possibly the greatest ever English Briton, but there's no question at all that he did some terrible things and said some awful things. And we should be able to look at both, understand the complexity of Winston Churchill, and he himself would have wanted that, by the way. I quite have no doubt, and he would have done it very well. But instead of which, we now have we're sort of trying to say there is only one way of understanding what Britain is about. And this is awful. And the attack on, we sort of move towards America or France even in our attack, and our abandoning the sort of wonderful collective way in which Britain has, for hundreds of years, enabled all kinds of different cultures, religions, ethnic sort of groups or whatever it was, that, you know, we've allowed people to interact and live together. And there's become a new sort of deliberate attempt by this government to create division where previously people were rubbing along as best they could. I find troubling, and you can see what it can lead to. Terrible things. History shows you that if you're going to create division, it can lead to awful things.
On that note, have you received any sort of reviews from the right-wing press, your previous partners, if you like, about your book?
No, I'm quite interesting that I've had not one review in the Murdoch press, or not one review in the Associated Newspapers, and not one review in the Telegraph group. I think they account for the great majority of newspaper readers. So I'm very grateful that you've had me on and to talk about it.
And the second thing I want to ask you, I think I've read somewhere, not in your book, that you were going to present the case to the Speaker of the House of what the Prime Minister lied. Have you received any responses from that?
Yes, I sent the book and also a list of 15 falsehoods uttered on the floor of the House of Commons to the Speaker, not just to the Speaker, to Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House. I sent it to the leader of the opposition. I sent this list to various other sort of significant political figures, and I did get a response from the Speaker eventually. It took a long time, and I had a chat with him. I think it was off the record, and I think I respect that. But he was clearly concerned, and I've noticed that he has started to raise the issue of speaking honestly with MPs, and he has raised the issue of not misleading. I'm not claiming the credit for that, but I'm very pleased that he's done that, and I hope he sticks with it. But I think we need to do more. We've got to look at the way. We've got to make sure that the institutions which exist to ensure that political lying is made unacceptable are strengthened. There is, at the moment, there's no real mechanism, because the ministerial code, which we talked about, which is about integrity and about no conflicts of interest, it's about telling the truth, it's about being responsible, it's about being open. Who is in charge of that? Mr. Boris Johnson, in his capacity as Prime Minister, and he is showing no interest at all in enforcing that code. He's allowing the most terrible things and dishonest things and corrupt things to happen, and really it's not acceptable. What is there out there to force him to behave properly? The only thing is Parliament, but who is the majority in Parliament? That is MPs. So it's and he has 80. The Tory party has a majority in Parliament. So at the moment they can get away constitutionally with anything they like, and that is terrible. It's a betrayal of the Conservative Party, by the way, that's why I find it terrible. That is not what the Conservative Party is for.
Try and end on a positive note, because we've only got a couple of minutes left, Peter. How can people who are listening and watching us today become active and try and sort of direct this move that has taken place in the past few years?
Well, I do think that we have a moral emergency. If you see things being wrong, get in touch with your MPs, write to them, go and see them. If you are lied about, and this happens a lot to Muslims, challenge it. Challenge the minister. If the Prime Minister lies about you, challenge him. You can do it, and I'll talk to you about technical ways you can do it. It takes a little bit of doing, but you cannot just be inert. Otherwise, you move towards a sort of Orwellian situation where right is wrong, where truth is falsehood, and we are moving in that direction. And I do list at the back of the book a number of ways in which we can fight against it. So struggle for the truth, struggle for justice.
Peter, I would carry on, wanted to carry on a lot longer, but I'm afraid time has come to stop us. So once again, thank you for joining us. And to all our viewers, I really recommend this book. It's a must read for anybody who wants to know what the political situation of our country is in. So once again, to our viewers and to you, Peter, thank you very much and hope to see you again.
Thank you very much, Ismail. It's lovely of you to have, it's been such an honor to talk to you.